Olympus, an Asian brand revered around the globe. The company took the world of photography by storm in the early 1970s with a camera of uncompromising quality.
This is the Olympus 1970s film cameras. This is one of the aesthetic that I love.
In 1972, a legend was born. The Olympus OM1 was half the weight of rival cameras without sacrificing any professional features. It would be years before the rest of the pack caught up. But then Olympus was hit by a corporate scandal that rocked the business world.
At the time, I thought it was ridiculous. I didn't believe it.
It was 13 years of covering up bad corporate practices from a company that everyone admired.
This is the story of how one of Asia's greatest companies rose from the ashes of one of the industry's worst corporate scandals.
He was going to get to the bottom of what had happened, and Olympus's management did not want that to happen.
Based in Shinjuku, Tokyo, Olympus has made a name for itself as a global player in the world of photography. It also diversified into high-tech medical equipment, establishing itself as one of the leading manufacturers of endoscopy equipment. Anne Valerie Olsen, Professor of Business Strategy, uses Olympus as a case study for her students.
Olympus was always known for high-quality products. It actually started in 1919 in Tokyo making microscopes, and so naturally moved on to medical technology devices. And then with time, it started making lenses because it was making lenses for the microscopes anyway. And from there, it went into the camera business and into digital photography.
In 1936, they introduced their first camera, the Semi-Olympus 1.
People think of Olympus as a camera company, but it's really one of the, it's probably the best medical equipment franchise in the world. I mean, it really is. It's like the Google of the endoscope business.
With Japan's economic boom in the 1970s, Olympus strengthened its production base and expanded it internationally with 3 core products: microscopes, cameras, and medical devices.
Well, you can't take a bad picture, Cheryl.
Neither can you with Olympus OM10.
So Olympus had a very good reputation. In terms of culture, it was very Japanese. But Kikukawa, their CEO, actually applied a Western management style to the company and was lauded for that. He was a very charismatic person, very well liked, and so the company invested heavily in innovation, a lot more than a lot of the other Japanese companies at the time. What we mean when we say Japanese culture is that we refer more to collectivist cultures, as is the case in a lot of Asian countries. So there's a great sense of loyalty towards one's employer. It's cultures that tend to be quite hierarchical, where one does not question authority and where one goes with what the boss says. So very loyal, very strong, bonded cultures.
Kikukawa joined Olympus in 1964 and rose through the ranks to become president in 2001. He was well respected by his peers and was instrumental in pushing Olympus forward in the digital era. And in 2011, he hired their first foreign president and chief operating officer, Michael Woodford. Woodford had already made a name for himself by growing Olympus's international medical business significantly. Kikukawa was confident that he could do likewise at their Tokyo headquarters.
I turned up in the Monolith building at the headquarters of Olympus in Shinjuku, and I was taken in to see Kikukawa. He was a very charming man. He talked to me about, my family, and he knew them all by name. And then he said he'd been running the company for 10 years. He didn't think he'd changed it enough. and felt, I could do what was necessary, and would I take the job? And we didn't discuss terms or anything. I just said yes.
In his 30 years at Olympus, Woodford's impact quickly earned him a position heading the company's European business. There, he successfully overhauled the European operations and made it profitable. Kikukawa was impressed with his accomplishments and trusted him.
Kikukawa and the rest of the board were very happy to appoint him, said that Woodford had exceeded all expectations and that he would make a great CEO. And this is CEO of the medical technology devices, so medical devices not of all of Olympus. It was global head.
Hiring a foreigner as president and COO is unusual in the Japanese corporate environment. In most businesses, the practice is to hire employees fresh out of university who then work their way up the ladder.
And of course, it takes a long time to become a board member of a company. If we look back 30, 40 years ago, basically no foreigners were hired by Japanese companies, right?
But from the start, there were signs that the new appointment might not be all that it seemed. Woodford soon realized that he did not have the power to make fundamental decisions, as Kikukawa created the position of CEO for himself.
When I was offered the job and became president, that's what I thought I was becoming. But Kikukawa-san had other ideas. The president formerly would have been the CEO, but he made himself chairman and CEO, which I came to realize meant that he controlled the board. I quickly saw that he controlled all the levers, and the board were literally puppets, and he was the puppet master. There was no ifs or buts. It's whatever Kikukawa said was the course to be followed.
In 2011, less than 4 months after being appointed president, Woodford stumbled on a long-buried secret about Olympus, made public in a local magazine.
I was in Hamburg chairing the European board meeting, and in a break I received an email from a friend of mine. He said, "Michael, you need to know this magazine Factor has made these extraordinary revelations about Olympus."
It had this article suggesting that some of the acquisitions that Olympus made there was something wrong with them. They'd paid too much money to people whose identities could not be really ascertained. So what was the purpose of these deals, was what it was asking.
Woodford contacted his close friend Waku Miller, his translator for corporate relations with the Japanese media, and showed him the shocking allegations.
To be perfectly honest with you, and this is something that I will be ashamed of to the grave. The tone of the magazine is very forceful, it's very sensational, and the tone put me off. I mean, the tone of the article made me not want to believe it. I should have put up a bigger red flag for me than it did. Micah was very concerned about the amount of debt that they had incurred, and I should have paid more attention to that.
Woodford was eager to get to the bottom of the controversial charges, and the only way was to speak directly to his boss, Kikukawa.
And I phoned my secretary, Michiko, and said, "Michiko, can I see Kikukawa, please? It's very important." And then Michiko phones back and says, "Michael, flat as a pancake. Kikukawa-san is very, very busy today," his secretary tells me. But as you're so insistent, and adds emphasis to the word insistent, he will see you today at lunchtime.
This was the first time that Woodford realized the limits on his authority inside Olympus. When he started asking questions and he was getting stonewalled, it was a real shock for him to realize that he was shackled in this way.
Woodford was able to get Kikukawa and Vice President Hisashi Mori to meet him in person.
I can remember that lunch meeting, the first time I was to challenge and confront Kikukawa vividly, like it was yesterday. And I walked in, and there was a large boardroom table, and right in the center was Kikukawa-san, the chairman, and Mori-san, who in effect managed all the financial transactions of the company.
Kikukawa and Mori sat dead center of a long table.
Where I was to sit was a tuna sandwich. And if you're not Japanese, you may not understand the significance. I mean, everyone knew I loved sushi. But this tuna sandwich, it was still wrapped up. In Japan, you would never leave the cling film on it. There was no salad or crisps around it. It was just a, you know, you just would never do that in Japan. And I understood, and I was thrown that, you know, it disorientated me that the message for me, and many of the messages in Japan, is non-verbal communication. Kikukawa was the luxury sushi platter at Olympus, and I was the manky tuna sandwich, and I shouldn't forget it.
For Woodford, the message was clear. Without uttering a single word, Kikukawa had made it clear that, as a foreigner, Woodford had no business interfering in Olympus's most sensitive affairs.
And smiling away, and he said, Michael, you're too busy to worry about these domestic issues.
As the president of Olympus, Woodford knew it was his responsibility to sign off the accounts and answer to the company auditors.
So I said, you know, I know that you are very busy today. Can I suggest that I talk with Mori-san alone? He didn't like it. Then he sort of huffed and gruffed and left the room, and I was then alone with Mori.
As vice president at Olympus, Mori reported directly to Woodford, who expected transparency and honesty from his staff. Woodford was disappointed that Mori had withheld the Factor article from him and pressed him further on the allegations of 3 terrible acquisitions, including a face cream and microwave company, as well as paying $687 million in advisory fees to an unknown company in the Cayman Islands.
And he just ignored my questions, and it was one of the most disorientating things I've ever had in my life. I started, you know, to get tense with him. And I said, we bought a company which makes microwave dishes. I mean, we're a healthcare company, Mori-san.
It was obvious there was something very wrong.
So not only were they paying a lot of money for companies that weren't making a lot of money, simply put, but on top of it, they were paying consulting fees for advice that was no way worth that amount of money.
And I got angry, and I got up, and I walked around the table and came very close to him. And I asked him, I said, you know, Mori-san, you know, who do you work for? Who do you work for? You know, as long as I live, I'll never forget Mori's response to that question. And he pointed. And he said to me, I work for Kikukawa-san! I'm loyal to Kikukawa-san!
In 2011, English businessman Michael Woodford, who'd been brought in to modernize Japanese electronics giant Olympus, was being increasingly isolated from company chairman Kikukawa and other senior managers at Olympus. He'd found evidence of serious corporate wrongdoing. Now he had to make a tough decision. Do you continue demanding answers, or do you quietly fall into line? Woodford's mother instilled in him a strong sense of right and wrong when he was still a little boy.
I remember I went to buy some chocolate, and I took some money from her purse, and I thought she wouldn't notice. And when I came back, she was waiting for me, and she had quite a temper. And I thought I was gonna, you know, I was really gonna be in for it. But all she said to me was, you know, you've stolen money from one of your family, you know, what does that say about you, you know, if I can't trust my own son? And, you know, that was seared on my consciousness about, you know, stealing, and even if you could get away from it, what does it say about you?
Praveen Nair is a business psychologist with almost 2 decades of experience.
What tends to drive a whistleblower to speak out would be where they fall within this continuum of justice and loyalty. So if we were to do it like a straight line, and justice being over here and loyalty being over here, the closer they are to the justice aspect would probably make them more likely to speak out.
Woodford's connection to Olympus began with him working for one of their contractors, Keymed, in 1981, where he ran a tight ship. This was when he first met Waku Miller.
My firm was producing a Japanese language magazine for the British Embassy. One of our stops was the company Keymed in Southend. And Michael was the president of Keymed at the time we visited. My first experience with Michael was having them check the reverse English translation of the draft that we'd written about the company. And it was a tremendously trying experience. He was just absolutely obsessive about perfection.
Woodford went on to head Olympus's entire European business.
Michael Woodford was very successful in Europe, and he managed to restructure the European organization in a very solid way. He was also very well known for his compliance issues and regulations. He strikes me as a real goal-getter. Very intelligent, very smart, business smart, but also very well versed to lead a team towards success as a company, towards a financial solid company. And I think that Kikukawa at that moment was very appreciative of that and brought him into Tokyo.
As head of Olympus Europe, Woodford made the region the biggest contributor to the company's profits. It was then that President Kikukawa offered him the presidency.
Michael Woodford spent almost his entire career at Olympus. So he's always had this reputation of being somebody that was very honest, very ethical, and would go out of his way to call on people if they weren't being honest and ethical. He started off initially at Cadbury Schweppes. Before that, he was an intern in a small aerospace company, and there he already had the reputation of a whistleblower. So at the time, he had denounced, I guess is the word, a secretary that had used office stamps to send her holiday post. And he had been asked to leave because of that, and then it had proven to be true.
As Woodford probed deeper and demanded answers of the dubious acquisitions, his relationship with Kikukawa and Mori worsened.
After the showdown over the sushi platter, the relationship between myself, Kikukawa, and Mori deteriorated, but we went through the motion.
The allegations against Olympus had been published by Factor less than a month ago, and Woodford needed to find a way out of the Tokyo office that could allow him to probe further.
You know, I could feel the contempt oozing from them. I've never felt such loathing in my life. I went to Kikukawa and said to him, you know, I think I should visit our factories which lie outside of Japan, and in the Czech Republic, in Germany, in Britain, in America. And he snapped at it. You know, he wanted me out of the Tokyo office as much as I wanted to be out of there. And that was the longest business trip I ever went on. And it ended in September in New York.
By this time, the pressure of the unlawful allegations was beginning to take its toll.
I was drinking a lot by then, just to try and sedate myself. We went to a steak restaurant, and I got back, and it was around 11:30 at night. And I remember going into the bathroom and looking in the mirror, and I was 5 kilos less than I am now, and dark, you know, inset eyes. But it wasn't my physical condition which was troubling me. I knew my mental well-being, my mental health was deteriorating because, you know, I knew there was this sickness, this problem, but I wasn't sure of what to do. You know, how do I deal with it? You know, the shareholders don't seem interested, the financial institutions, the media. No one seems to, you know, is it me who's mad?
He also realized the board was not aligned with him and wouldn't allow any more investigation into the allegations around these fraudulent or dubious acquisitions.
Woodford was having sleepless nights and was becoming dependent on sleeping pills.
And I remember I had a brown plastic Perspex bottle of sleeping tablets. And I looked on the back and it said, don't mix with alcohol. And I know that's not a good idea, but I thought a worse idea was not to sleep. So I took 2 of them, went to sleep almost immediately.
If you've worked in a company for around 30 years, you'd feel very close affinity to that company. And to have that company suddenly do something that you're not familiar with or against your personal beliefs, that's almost akin to having a family member go against you. So that would definitely create feelings of tension that could have manifested in mood swings. It could have manifested in sleeplessness. It could have manifested in not being able to sustain positive relationships in your life.
When you're traveling particularly, you become even more addictive, you know, to opening up your emails to see if there's a message maybe your children have written to you.
But awaiting Woodford in his inbox was worse news. The same business magazine had published a follow-up article containing more allegations against Olympus, alleging possible links to organised crime.
But what shocked me, it said that these transactions were linked to anti-social forces, a euphemism for the mafia, the Yakuza. But the idea that there could be people with tattoos and missing finger digits who might want to hurt me, or worse still, hurt my wife, or even worse, hurt my children. You know, I was a businessman. You know, I sent out mission statements, answered emails, and visited factories. I had no knowledge of how to cope with organized crime.
Whistleblowing is not something that is going to be easy for anyone. And normally, whether or not someone whistleblows will depend a lot on their personal characteristics. In Michael Woodford's case, perhaps what was going on is what we term dissonance, cognitive dissonance. And that is basically when an individual holds 2 contrasting beliefs at the same time, and it creates a lot of tension, discomfort, a lot of mental pressures.
Despite the growing psychological pressure, Woodford continued to press for answers. Having already tried to raise his concerns in meetings and being rebuffed with tuna sandwiches, the revelations in this second factor article encouraged Woodford to put his concerns in writing. Over the next 6 weeks, Woodford wrote a series of official emails challenging Kikukawa and the Olympus board.
Kikukawa actually wrote to me and said, Michael, it's not helpful you asking all these questions. I'm sure it wasn't helpful. I copied them to all the board members.
Yet in October 2011, Kikukawa appointed Woodford CEO as well as president. But what may have seemed to be a positive change was actually hardly publicised in Japan.
I think what's interesting and one intriguing anecdote is the fact that when Woodford was appointed CEO, so even after he was promoted from CEO to CEO position, his promotion was only written up in the English language website and not on the Japanese website.
But in actual fact, when I became CEO, he had blind, utter loyalty from all the other board members who were all Japanese males in the latter stages of their career. Complete blind loyalty.
But the promotion didn't stop Woodford from continuing to ask difficult questions. He wrote his final email to the board, this time copying in an outside auditing firm.
The last letter I wrote in the UK, and I included a report from PwC, an independent auditor, one of the big 4, which confirmed the concerns I had. Now, for the other directors, 1.7 billion US dollars had been spent on these 3 Mickey Mouse companies, and from this consultancy, from a company which went under the name of Axim or ASIS. Even if those people were the devil personified, for their own self-interest, the president is asking to bring in forensic accountants.
Within the same email, Woodford explicitly asked for the resignation of Kikukawa as well as Mori.
I pressed it. You watch the thing, email send. And then I watched to see, because I asked for reply receipts. And, half an hour later, I saw that a Japanese director working in the United States responded and, had read it. And then obviously he had phoned and woken everyone up in Tokyo, and they all started to come in.
Woodford was summoned to an extraordinary board meeting back in Tokyo.
I walk into the boardroom at a few minutes before 9. This, long board table again. But the board meeting has a lot of pomp and ceremony, and there's all these people on a second group of chairs behind in tables, translators and note takers and advisors and all sorts of people. And when I walk in, it was noisy, much more noisy, and it reminded me of one of those wildlife programs with hyenas. It had that feel of hysteria in the room. I was sitting there feeling very uncomfortable, noting that nobody will look at me, this non-verbal communication. And a few minutes past 9, and I start to look at my watch in an exaggerated manner, because meetings never start late.
This was the meeting that would change the fates of Olympus and Woodford forever. English businessman Michael Woodford had taken an extraordinary business decision, demanding the resignation of the top man at Olympus, the same man who had given him his job. The board immediately called an emergency meeting. Almost 15 minutes later, Kikukawa turned up.
And Kikukawa didn't come to his seat at the top of the table. He went to the podium in the far corner of the room. So he got this tatty piece of paper out of his pocket and said, "Today's meeting's to discuss serious concerns about Olympus." And he said, that has been cancelled, that agenda. And the new agenda is the dismissal of Michael Woodford as president, representative director, and CEO. And on the last syllable, all the people around the table put their hands up, supporting the motion that I'm dismissed. I wanted to speak at the board meeting. I had a document I had prepared the night before of questions I wanted to ask, but I was told that I wasn't allowed to speak.
Less than 8 months after being named president of the Japanese electronics brand, and barely a fortnight after becoming CEO, Michael Woodford was left with no choice but to pack his belongings and leave the building. But just as he was leaving, another senior Olympus executive entered his office.
And he's a big guy, as big as me, and he came up to me and he called me by my first name, Michael. Now, I don't mind what people call me, but he didn't normally. It was Woodford-san, or president, in Japanese. But again, it was a way of asserting. And he said to me, "Give me your computers." Then I said, "I can't, because they've already gone back to the UK securely." He got very angry and then demanded my mobile phones. And I had a Samsung, which I gave him. And I smiled at him and said, "I've wiped it." And then I had my Apple iPhone, and I said, again, I got angry and said, "My wife is going to be worried, Who are you? Are you a policeman? Are you going to take it off me? I'm not going to give it you."
Woodford's translator, an American who now calls himself Waku Miller, had worked closely with him and was handling his corporate relations with the Japanese media. He was one of the first to find out about the sacking.
They fire Michael. because even though he's been in the organization for 30 years, they've discovered to their great surprise that this person is in fact unilateral and arbitrary in his management style, and that he's simply not suited to a Japanese organization. He was going to get to the bottom of what had happened at this company, and Olympus's management did not want that to happen.
Woodford left the Olympus office and headed back to his apartment in Tokyo. At the reception area, he noticed several heavily muscled men.
Who are these people? And that just fed my fear. And I'm very particular about the way I pack because I travel a lot. But I just threw everything into this case and was out of the 8 or 9 minutes, and they were still there in the library downstairs. You know, I was sweating profusely. I was starting to tremble. I phoned Jonathan Sobel from there, who was the Financial Times correspondent in Japan. And I said, Jonathan, you know, there's so much more to this, you know, can we meet? And he said, there's a small cafe across the road. And we met in there 10 minutes later.
My first question was, you know, are you okay? What happened? He said there's hundreds of millions of dollars missing. And it became clear that he was worried that he was in danger, that people might be following him or worse. A lot of money had left Olympus. A lot of money had been taken out of this company in mysterious and suspicious ways. He explained what he thought was happening inside Olympus. He presented me with a binder full of evidence to back up his case. And then he went to the airport. He took a suitcase and said, you know, I want to get on the first plane that I can. I don't feel safe. And I spent the next few hours going through his evidence. Of course, I contacted Olympus to get a comment from them. Talked over it with editors and lawyers. And the thing he said to me before he left was, you know, can I trust you to carry this story through? And then 10 hours later, he got off that plane, a plane in Heathrow, and his wife was there with a copy of the FT that she bought at the airport, I think, with his story on the front page.
Back in the UK, Woodford was determined to hold Kikukawa and his board accountable. He did as many interviews with the international press as possible, making sure that the scandal went global.
All of them have to go. All of them have to go. If they don't, then that means there's a tolerance of either incompetence or much, much worse.
As well as continuing to talk to the media, he started planning his next direct move against Olympus.
We're making progress.
I'd put together a new board of all Japanese senior figures, but the institutional shareholders, it became clear they wouldn't speak out, they wouldn't criticize Olympus. This is the 3 mega banks and the insurance company. You know, whilst I'd hoped I could get Olympus back on, you know, the right path, I knew it was beyond my abilities to change Japan. You know, corporate Japan needed to change, and you know, I couldn't do that.
Olympus stuck to their story. Their official stance? Woodford did not understand Japanese business practices. A new president was brought in for damage control.
ということになりますと、これは医療のこの条件の中ではですね、適切だったというふうに私は考えています。ウッドフォード氏は本来取締役でありながら会社内の機密情報を全部開示してしまったわけですよね。で、このことについて我々としてはですね、大変な憤りを感じているわけであります。
I think that they were just desperately hoping they could get away with it, that they could contain it, that they could discredit him. The whole way along, they underestimated how much was going to come out no matter what they said. They would admit only the bare minimum.
That people are basically with one company for all their career, and I think this sort of dominates a lot of the things that we see in the Japanese company. Because often what is called loyalty might also be dependence as someone for his career, for his well-being.
And I've heard the Japanese media described by many as sycophantic, that they bow down to the big Japanese corporations and don't want to rock the boat and ask the difficult questions. And definitely from the outside, looking at how they behaved, as a former journalist myself, that's exactly what they were doing in this case.
While the Japanese media shied away from the story, the international media latched onto it. The sheer scale of the fraud meant that the fallout was going to get bigger. Mark Worthington is an expert on how to manage business scandals. After a decade as correspondent for BBC News, he currently oversees crisis communication strategies for several multinational corporations.
Well, the fact that the company was still denying, even when the international media were writing openly about the allegations and referring to the CEO as being the one who was making them, is quite extraordinary. It's hard to see how that could happen anywhere else other than Japan. It seemed a pretty indefensible position, and yet the denials were still coming. And a motivating factor for that can only be the kind of corporate loyalty and that culture that you find in Japan. That was hugely damaging to their reputation. In a situation like this, when a company like Olympus faces these kinds of challenges, the worst thing you can possibly do is be seen to be denying, lying, covering up.
By November 2011, Olympus finally admitted to hiding massive losses. The company revealed that they'd made dubious acquisitions to cover up bad investments since before 1990. It had taken 20 years for their wrongdoings to come to light. Kikukawa resigned 2 weeks prior to the admissions, and Mori was dismissed for his role in the fraud. But this was only the beginning of a massive shake-up within the Olympus board.
In December, retired Supreme Court Judge Kanaka reported, and a huge report, and described Olympus as a board of yes men, and vindicated the action I'd taken, which then led really to the whole board having to step down at the extraordinary general meeting the following April.
Today at those meetings, for the first time, I had a sense of relief comparable to when Jonathan published, is that this story will be different.
The Tokyo District Court ruled that dismissed President Tsuyoshi Kikukawa and 5 other members of the board had to pay more than $500 million to Olympus. But the damage had already been done. Olympus shares, which remained steady since the scandal broke out, suddenly plummeted by almost 70% in less than a month.
The impact of this scandal on Olympus reputationally, in terms of its finances, in terms of its staff, were colossal and cannot be underestimated. If we start on a reputational level, they became almost the poster child for corporate fraud, corporate failure, corporate cover-up, and their name became synonymous with those things.
The Olympus case raised wider questions on how corporations were managed. Japanese financial regulators had long tolerated a common business practice of hiding losses, known in Japan as tobashi.
What happened is that in the 80s, many companies had some problems growing their main markets any longer, especially after the evaluation of the yen, and the yen increased in value, and maybe some of their overseas markets broke away. Japanese companies looked for other ways to increase their revenues.
Many of these companies made disastrous investments that ended up in massive losses. And when the Japanese bubble finally burst, most of the corporations didn't know how to cover their tracks.
The tobashi was a way to hide those losses in some affiliated companies, maybe with some other companies, so that the losses would not appear in the books of the main and in the balance statements of the main company any longer. And But eventually they had to pay up for that. And I think this is when companies got into problems, finding ways to make up for those losses.
The Tobashi scheme was banned in early 2000s, but there are still Japanese corporations that continue with it behind closed doors. In 2015, Toshiba president Hiesao Tanaka was forced to step down at the electronics and computer giant when a similar scandal came to light.
Since the Olympus scandal, there's been a new corporate governance code put in place that recommends things like putting independent directors on the boards of every company, that kind of thing, which had not been common in Japan before that. This effort was underway before the Olympus scandal, but the Olympus scandal, I think, definitely gave it a kind of tailwind that helped convince some skeptics that it was worthwhile to try and repair the reputation for Japanese financial markets and companies.
For a lot of people, there was no sense to leave the company immediately because the fundamentals of the company and the structure that was in the various regions and in the various organizations was good.
But change was still needed at the top. A new board took over the reins from Kikukawa and set out to restructure the company.
They wanted to go back into the core business of medical clinical division, microscopy products, and the camera products.
They also took a number of steps in terms of corporate governance, reporting, making sure they had external auditors that were really independent and not linked to the board in any way.
The scandal was reminiscent of the collapse of American gas and energy giant Enron some 10 years before. This led to a commitment to the comprehensive reform of business practices, setting new compliance standards for corporate management.
The Olympus case did for Japan what Enron did for the US. So every time you have a scandal, policymakers, shareholders, boards will question the way business was always done and whether it should be done this way. And just like it changed, Enron changed the governance policies and the board liabilities and so on in the US. Olympus did the same thing for Japanese businesses.
When we look at Olympus today, it is hugely different to the Olympus at the time the scandal took place. And the fact that trust had been completely destroyed left them with no choice but to completely rebuild and to rebuild very openly. So we saw the new management talk about total transparency.
In 2012, Olympus released a report to reassure their investors. Led by new president Hiroyuki Sasa from their medical equipment marketing division and former banker Yasuyuki Kimoto as their new chairman, the board promised to win back public trust and to prevent another scandal from occurring.
They comprehensively overhauled the way that the company was structured, the way that it communicated, the way that it was governed, making sure that checks and balances were in place, but also demonstrating openly to investors and the outside world what was happening. Because in a situation like the one Olympus faced, when you are that broken and your reputation is that low, you're not going to be able to communicate your way out of that situation. You have to demonstrate what you're doing.
A new set of protocols was put in place to regain the public's trust. And it started with the most basic, regulations and signatories.
The way Olympus was recovering and gained the trust back from the public and from their customers was to put regulations in place, regulations on signatories. People, for certain amounts, a certain level of signatures were required and always in twofold. Others were regulations that all the staff had to sign forms that they will not conduct any wrongdoings with money like briberies or even sponsorships, etc. So everything was very much scrutinized. So once the company was restructured, or the board of the company was restructured, everything recovered quite easily because the local structures of the organizations were very solid and very good.
Despite the scandal, the public perception of Olympus as a manufacturer of high-tech cameras hasn't faded. And the tech team is still creating new products that keep the brand relevant. Lance Ong is a camera fan who swears by the Olympus equipment range. He's been using their cameras since 2002 and vouches for their quality, which has vastly improved despite the internal mismanagement.
2012, they are the first one who introduced the 5-axis image stabilization, which is the first in the world. And also that is the game changer for the whole mirrorless system, where all other brands start to jump into mirrorless system where to compete with Olympus.
Mirrorless cameras drastically reduce the size of previously bulky DSLR systems without sacrificing image quality. A camera setup is now a fraction of what it used to cost, making photography much more affordable to both professionals as well as enthusiasts.
The greatest advantage for Olympus to go into Micro Four Third, where they make the camera smaller, yet you can still have a digital SLR image quality. This changed the whole ball game, where they become the leading brand of mirrorless. And till today, they are still one of the leading brands for camera system or mirrorless camera system.
Since the fraud, Michael Woodford has published a book, Exposure Inside the Olympus Scandal, detailing his role as a whistleblower in the indictment of the former Olympus board. These days, Woodford works as a consultant for many large companies, advising them on how to prevent the same thing from happening to their corporations.
Signs that Olympus has come out of the crisis are now all around us. Their name is no longer a name that is associated with the misdeeds of the past. Probably the first indicator to the outside world is the share price when the confidence starts to return. And that's the market looking at the steps that have been taken, reading in depth the documents that are setting out the new corporate governance policies, the philosophies of the new leadership.
So 6 years on, they still have a big share of the market in endoscopy and microscopy, and they're doing very well with their camera business. So they were able to turn around and they're doing well again. So back from the brink.